Hi, I'm Adam Sussman, Director of Research at TABB Group, joined by Cheyenne Morgan, Analyst at TABB Group. And today we're going to talk about the last but not least SEC Roundtable on undisplayed liquidity. Cheyenne, what did you think was the most interesting discussion during this panel?
Well, first off, one of the major points that was made, I think it was towards the end of the panel, an exchange, a little bit of a heated exchange between Larry Leibowitz and Dan Matheson talking about who should become exchanges. And I think the point there was there has to be a careful balance between business models, and we have to watch carefully how closely dark pools become to the business model of exchanges. And then once we go from there, we can decide who should register to become an exchange and who shouldn't. It was pretty funny that Dan Matheson said, "I would love to become an exchange."
Right.
And that was kind of intriguing because like Larry Leibowitz said, there's a lot of regulatory things that stop you when you're in exchange. So it takes 2 years for a rule to get passed or something like that. And to Dan Matheson's point, they do get tape revenue, and they aren't required to have. They don't have net capital requirements as the others do. So I thought that point was really interesting.
Right, and I think that it seemed to me the conclusion was that, hey, there are trade-offs to becoming an exchange. There are advantages to being a dark pool, and just as people have to decide whether they trade in the dark or trade on the lit markets, as a business model, you have to decide where are your strengths. Is it as a dark pool or is it as an exchange?
Yep,
I don't think, it was kind of like you could have flipped the question to Larry and said, all right, Larry, if you think it's so great to not be an exchange, why don't you just start a dark pool then, right? So, and clearly neither of them really want to do what the other is doing. They're just looking for, competitive differentiation.
Right, and that kind of goes back to what Fidelity was saying, was that, all of these venues have value propositions, and you might use every single one to execute one order in one day. And so, whether it be exchanges or dark pools, they each have their place, like you said.
Yep. I think coming on the heels of that is the discussion about fair access versus open access, where I think it was Dan that said, hey, fair access doesn't mean open access. It means let's create a set of rules. It should be a clear set of rules, and the decision to let people in should not be arbitrary.
Right.
It should be based on a clearly set, defined of rules. Whereas the response to that, coming from Andrew Silverman from Morgan Stanley, was, well, I would love to do that, but I need to know who is really the end user coming into my pools, because I want to protect my clients from certain,
predatory flow.
For certain predatory flow.
Yeah, and I think his other point there was that, when you make that criteria too standardized, you kind of lose some differentiation there.
Right.
And you don't want to do that. You want to be able to say, this is my dark pool, this is exactly what I provide for you, this is exactly my value proposition, and this is why you should come to me for this type of flow.
I thought the other really interesting point was about defining what is toxic flow. One of the panelists went through the explanation of how institutional order flow first goes to the dark pools, then it might go into a dark order book on a lit exchange, then finally if it can't do anything, or if it can't find anything else, then it goes to the lit. And so they kind of describe that as exhaust or as toxic. And that order flow then intersects with limit orders, which are mostly being posted by HFTs, which are also considered toxic flow. So it was kind of interesting that it seemed like, oh, okay, so what we're saying is that basically everything on the exchange is toxic for very different reasons.
I know, yeah. And that was pretty interesting that a debate started there between the relationship between market orders and limit orders. And I'm not really sure if the entire panel was was actually sure of how that related. And I think somebody on the panel made the point that we have to understand how that relates to each other and how that those orders match up. And basically, one of the other big major points was not necessarily big changes needs to be made, but we need to understand how everything interacts, how the exchanges interacts with the dark pools. And the buzzword fragmentation was thrown out there a lot, but like someone said, a lot of these venues are complementary to each other, and we have to learn how they interact with each other. Right.
I thought the other point that was actually brought up at the beginning of the panel by Mark Reddy, the finance professor, was, why are we so concerned, or are we overly concerned about the way that institutional investors' orders impact the market? Because at the end of the day, the portfolio manager is saying, hey, a stock is trading at 20, I think it's worth 40. Well, of course, as their order enters into the market and it pushes it towards 40, it's actually it's making the price of the stock more efficient by the very nature of that order being there. So I thought that was kind of, people don't, I haven't really heard that mentioned. Usually it's, we got to protect against market impact, with the, forgetting about, well, if they think it's really worth 40, then eventually it should trade at 40.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting point as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for joining us today, and we'll catch you next time.